Greetings from the Department of Education. I'm Dr. Deborah Duncan Owens, literacy education professor, researcher, but most of all, a teacher with over 30 years' experience on the front lines of education. Thank you for tuning in. If you like what you hear, please be kind enough to hit a like button and subscribe. Since the 1950s, when Rudolph Flesch published his bestseller, Why Johnny Can't Read, our nation has become increasingly fixated on phonics. It seems like every 10 years or so, there's a declaration that we have a reading crisis in our nation's schools. And the culprit seems to always be the teachers who refuse to teach phonics or simply don't know how to teach phonics. Legislatures, lobbyists, and corporate entities have made this a cause célèbre. But in reality, No Child Left Behind and Reading First 25 years ago, relying on the scientifically based reading research of the federally funded National Reading Panel report, enforced the teaching of phonics in early childhood classrooms. In short, 25 years ago, teaching phonics actually became the law of the land. I know because I was a teacher and reading specialist during the No Child Left Behind era. I think that's why I really can't understand why the science of reading movement moved like a wave, no, like a typhoon across the nation, fueled by Emily Hanford's Soul to Story podcast. And it seems that their fabrications, mistruths, or even lies about reading instruction, teachers, and teacher education programs have gone largely unchallenged by the media. Science of reading movement proponents claim that teachers, schools, and teacher educators are anti science, basically because they don't teach phonics adequately. But, and this is key to understanding all the rancorous debates about the failure of our schools and teachers to teach our children to read, there are basically two different approaches to teaching phonics. One is called analytic phonics, and the other is synthetic phonics. I'll explain the difference. But understand, these are certainly not new ideas. In 1889, Rebecca Smith Pollard published the complete manual, Pollard's Synthetic Method of Reading and Spelling. That was 1889. Pollard advocated for teaching the sounds of the letters as the starting point to teaching reading. Don't teach words first. Teach the letters and sounds first and go from there. That is synthetic phonics. In 1899, 10 years later, Sarah Louise Arnold provided a rationale for analytic phonics in her book, Reading, How to Teach It. Arnold cautioned against a synthetic phonics approach because so many English words do not comply with common phonics laws. Instead, she advocated for an analytic phonics method in which words are studied to discover word classifications. For example, she explained, whenever a type of word is represented, such as black, for example, the children should be taught to suggest other words which rhyme with that pattern, such as crack, back, lack, etc. Arnold explained that students could continue to study the sounds of words through the first 5 years of school. This process of analyzing words into separate sounds, accompanied by the classification of similar words, would become a habit and enables students to become independent readers. Now, note that Arnold, in advocating for an analytic phonics approach to phonics instruction, promoted the teaching of letter and letter combination sounds for the first 5 years of school. And Arnold's approach to teaching phonics has been the favored method for those teaching balanced literacy. Now, remember, this was 125 years ago. So when the science of reading movement folks talk about the absence of phonics in classrooms, well, they're just wrong. But let me digress for a moment. Horace Mann, the father of the Common School movement, rejected the practice of teaching reading that he was witnessing in the early years of common schools, in which letters and sounds were taught prior to teaching children to read words. The synthetic approach Pollard would promote almost 50 years later. In 1842, he described the practice of a teacher holding up a card of a letter and asking children or a single child to name the letter and its corresponding sound. Practice would go on through the alphabet, one letter at a time, until, as Mann described it, the vertical rows of lifeless and ill-favored characters is completed, and students are remanded to their seats. Mann would write, "If a child is bright, the time which passes during this lesson is the only part of the day in which he does not think. Not a single faculty of mind is exercised excepting that of imitating sounds, and even the number of these imitations is limited to only 26. A parrot or an idiot could do the same." When the science of reading proponents talk about phonics, they are only talking about the synthetic approach to teaching phonics. For them, analytic phonics is absolutely inadequate. In their eyes, Pollard is the winner. Arnold is the loser. Horace Mann, the father of the Common School movement that brought free public education to children across our nation, is the loser. The science of reading movement folks are the winners, and the balanced literacy advocates are the losers. But what does science really teach us about how children learn to read and the role of phonics? It was the report of the National Reading Panel that formed the basis over 20 years ago for No Child Left Behind and Reading First, and the creation of laws and mandates to enforce teaching phonics in early childhood classrooms. Well, Timothy Shanahan, professor emeritus at the University of Illinois at Chicago and founding director of the Center for Literacy, as well as a member of the International Literacy Association's Reading Hall of Fame, served on the committee investigating phonics for the National Reading Panel. In talking about his research, Shanahan stated that after reviewing 38 experimental studies on teaching phonics, there was no clear difference in the effectiveness between synthetic and analytic phonics. Any difference between the type of phonics that was the subject of the studies was not statistically significant. In other words, according to Shanahan, the benefit for students is found in the teaching of phonics, not in the type of phonics taught. What should have been a definitive conclusion by one of the researchers on the National Reading Panel, however, has not impacted the current education critics who are resurrecting the old trope about a lack of phonics instruction in schools in the United States. And we can also look to England for clarity about phonics instruction. For a number of years, England has explicitly required and enforced the teaching of synthetic phonics, the sounds of letters first before teaching words. But does scientific research support their mandates? In 2021, Dominic, Wyse, and Alice Bradbury published findings from their research on phonics and reading instruction in England. Their report is aptly titled Reading Wars or Reading Reconciliation, a critical examination of robust research evidence, curriculum policy, and teachers' practices for teaching phonics and reading. Based on their extensive research, Wyse and Bradbury concluded, our findings do not support a synthetic phonics orientation to the teaching of reading. They suggest that a balanced instruction approach is more likely to be successful. They also suggest the need for a new, more careful consideration of the strengths and weaknesses of whole language as an orientation to teaching reading. The reading wars have often resulted in some very dismissive attitudes to whole language, a position that is not underpinned by research. Although there remains no doubt that phonics teaching in general is one important component in the teaching of reading, the research certainly does not suggest the complete exclusion of whole language teaching. In other words, after 15 years of implementing synthetic phonics methodologies as the primary focus for early reading instruction, Wyse and Bradbury are advocating a balanced approach to teaching reading. To be clear, they are not advocating for the elimination of phonics. In fact, they found that phonics is an essential component of reading instruction. It's important to understand that the concept of balanced literacy was developed as a way to end the reading wars by embracing the best features of the whole language orientation with its focus on language, reading, and writing in the early grades in conjunction with analytic phonics strategies with a student-centered approach. And now back to the National Reading Panel's findings. First, it's important to understand that their meta-analysis and findings were focused on comparisons of classrooms that taught some form of systematic phonics, either synthetic or analytic, versus classrooms that taught no phonics. That's an important distinction. Again, they did not find a statistically significant difference between the types of phonics taught, either synthetic or analytic. The key is a systemized approach to teaching phonics, following some sort of plan that provides a scope and sequencing in teaching phonemes and letters. Students taught phonics systematically fared better than those who received unsystematic phonics or no phonics at all. Second, the panel found that the greatest benefit of systematic phonics instruction occurred in kindergarten and first grade. Beyond the first grade, the benefits are reduced for students who are progressing without underlying difficulties. Third, and most importantly, the panel concluded, and I'm reading this directly from their report. Finally, it is important to emphasize that systematic phonics instruction should be integrated with other reading instruction to create, wait for it, a balanced reading program. Yes, that's what NRP concluded. Phonics instruction is never a total reading program. In first grade, teachers can provide controlled vocabulary texts that allow students to practice decoding, and they can also read quality literature to students to build a sense of story and to develop vocabulary and comprehension. Phonics should not become the dominant component in a reading program, neither in the amount of time devoted to it nor in the significance attached. You heard that right. It is important to evaluate children's reading competence in many ways, not only by their phonics skills, but also by their interest in books and their ability to understand information that is read to them. By emphasizing all the processes that contribute to growth in reading, teachers will have the best chance of making every child a reader. Catherine Snow of Harvard University and the chair of the committee that produced the 1998 federally funded report, Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children, stated that educators have long known what makes up effective early literacy education, teaching students languages, code, and meaning, and how they interact. She said, "It's not such a complicated thing to do." And she went on to say, "But people really want to go on fighting about this." And neuroscientist Stanislaw Dehaene, author of Reading in the Brain, The Science of How We Read, is arguably the definitive expert in the role of brain imaging in research in the science of reading. He explains that experimental psychologists established the parameters of the research protocols in brain imaging research studies. In the classroom, however, he says, teachers are at the helm. Neuroscientists working with researchers in the field of psychology and pedagogy hold the promise of scientific consensus on the mechanisms of literacy development and research on reading instruction. Dehaene calls this research neuropsychopedagogy as an integrated and cumulative approach where teacher autonomy is safeguarded, but instruction is aimed toward a pragmatic search for efficient strategies. And to this, I give a resounding amen. Teachers teach reading, not prepackaged scripted reading programs, not AI-driven computer programs. And teachers need autonomy to make data-driven decisions about how best to teach reading to their students. Some students, after all, come to school already reading, already having broken the code. Other students need a more systematic approach to learning to read and breaking the alphabetic code. Regardless, as Dehaene noted, teachers are and should be at the helm. Amen. Thank you. More to come.